So tonight's speaker is Jennie Ikuta, who is assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri. As a political theorist, she is interested in the role, of moral psychology in politics. Her first book, Contesting Conformity, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020 and examines the relationship between nonconformity and democracy in the thought of Tocqueville, Mill, and Nietzsche. She is currently at work on a second book project on the role of willful ignorance in sustaining racial injustice. And it's from that, I think that this talk is drawn. Two other things that I need to remind people of in a second, but this talk tonight is titled, Between Present and Future, on Du Bois's Radical Pessimism and Radical Hope. And since I forgot to do it just a second ago, I'm going to do it now. We are going to start recording, the talk. So I want to make sure that everybody also, is aware on Zoom that this is being recorded. So just FYI, here we go. Okay. So, okay.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kazarian. Thank you all for being out here tonight and being here to hear some of the things that I've been working on and thinking about for the last several months. So today's talk is called Between Present and Future, Du Bois's Radical Pessimism and Radical Hope. So in the wake of George Floyd's death on May 25th, 2020, protests spread like wildfire across the nation as multiracial crowds took to the streets to protest police killings of Black Americans. Such protests were nothing new, of course. Prior to 2020, there had been demonstrations for Trayvon Martin in Miami, for Michael Brown in Ferguson, for Eric Garner in New York City, and for Freddie Gray in Baltimore. But this time, things felt different. Not only were the 2020 uprisings larger than anything we had ever seen, but also most took place in counties with majority or even overwhelmingly white populations. Commentators highlighted how interracial these protests were, especially in contrast with the civil rights movement, where most white Americans were not actively engaged. Furthermore, the 2020 protests were framed in terms of a broader racial reckoning that went beyond challenging police brutality to include the systemic racism of which such brutality is a part. Support for Black Lives Matter surged. Protesters tore down Confederate statues. Anti-racism reading lists proliferated online. Corporations issued statements of solidarity and collectively pledged $50 billion of support for billions to support efforts for racial equity. Taken together, these developments were optimistically interpreted as proof that this time things were different. White Americans were finally waking up to the reality of white supremacy and were now motivated to do something about it. A more racially egalitarian society was closer now than ever before. Hope abounded. But developments over the last year, or lack thereof, suggest that such hope is perhaps at best premature. Since the summer protests, support for Black Lives Matter has precipitously declined to levels even lower than those prior to Floyd's death. This decline is the result of rapidly plummeting support from white Americans and Republicans, despite high levels of support from racial minorities. Moreover, of the $50 billion that corporations collectively pledged in support of racial equity efforts, less than 1% of it has been actually donated so far. A white insurrectionist mob stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, to overturn the results of a national election in which the outcome was decided by Black voters in cities with substantial Black populations, such as Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Atlanta. Since then, Republican lawmakers in every state, save two, have introduced 389 bills restricting access to the ballot, which will effectively and disproportionately bar Black Americans from the franchise. Given these developments over the last year, or lack thereof, a slew of commentators have now recently been arguing that, in fact, no racial reckoning has happened at all. In other words, over the span of a single year, the tenor regarding the politics of racial justice has swerved from incredible hope to incredible pessimism. How should we make sense of such hope and pessimism? And what does it suggest about the prospects, and specifically about the prospective timeline for a racially egalitarian society in the United States? In this talk today, I turn to Du Bois's writings between 1920 and 1940 for thinking through some of these questions. Today, I'm going to argue that Du Bois is radically pessimistic about the prospects of a racially egalitarian society in the present, and radically hopeful about the prospects for a racially egalitarian society in the long, distant future. In other words, Du Bois's writings between 1920 and 1940 are characterized by a dual pessimism and hope that map onto a dual temporal horizon, right? The present and the future, respectively. So here's a brief outline of the talk, right? In the first part, I'm going to lay out Du Bois's radical pessimism regarding the present prospects for a racially egalitarian society in the United States. According to Du Bois, the legacy of chattel slavery is such that social institutions, such as schools, the news, and art, have produced and continue to reproduce a robust subconscious desire in white Americans for racial dominance. And because a racially egalitarian society depends on a subconscious desire for racial equality that white Americans do not currently have, a racially egalitarian society is currently unrealizable. For this reason, Du Bois insists that Black Americans must ensure their well-being through voluntary self-segregation. That is, they must create and support separate Black schools and hospitals, and this is the subject of part 2. But while the subconscious desires of white Americans are presently unchangeable, Du Bois argues that they are changeable over the long term. And it's this changeability that gives him reason to hope for a racially egalitarian society in the very long, distant future. So part 3 turns our attention to propaganda, and specifically the medium of art through which Du Bois envisions such change can occur. Through propaganda, Du Bois argues that the white subconscious can be transformed from desiring racial dominance to desiring racial equality. And while transforming the white subconscious through propaganda is a frustratingly slow process, he remains hopeful that it is eventually possible in the far distant future. In short, Du Bois's dual pessimism and hope is a function of how he views the white desire for racial dominance as intractable. The intractability of this desire is neither easily changeable, nor is it unchangeable. As Du Bois sees it, Black Americans must act according to the presently unchangeable fact of white supremacy, even as they work to change this unchangeable fact over the long term. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Du Bois's present pessimism. And his pessimism really about the present prospects for a racially egalitarian society is a function of understanding whiteness as a subconscious desire for racial dominance. The subconscious desire is premised on, and I quote, the assumption that of all the hues of God, whiteness alone is inherently and obviously better than brownness or tan, end quote. According to Du Bois, because social institutions have inculcated whiteness as a subconscious impulse over multiple generations, white Americans do not actually desire equality. That white Americans do not desire equality is, as Du Bois sees it, a presently unchangeable fact. And because a multiracial democracy requires that its citizens desire equality with one another, he is pessimistic about the prospects of a racially egalitarian society for now. And this explains why he advocates for separate institutions. But more broadly, I want to say a little bit about some of sort of the intellectual background and the kind of historical background with which Du Bois is developing this line of thinking. And it's particularly helpful to understand his intellectual development in terms of a pre- and post-World War I era. And essentially, it comes down to his realization that facts are radically insufficient for getting white people to act differently. Right? So early on in his career, right up until about World War I, so right up until about 1920, he devotes a lot of his scholarly time and attention to trying to show that, right, the color of a person's skin has nothing to do with, natural ability, but rather that it's the legacies of slavery that explain the subordinate status of Black Americans, right? So he's drawing up all these sociological studies, right, like the Philadelphia Negro, because he thought that if he could just prove to white people, right, that there was no natural basis for racial subordination, then they would then cease to subordinate Black Americans, right? So the fundamental assumption here is that if white people just know better, then they will do better. The assumption is that knowledge motivates action. As he writes, and I quote, "My basic theory had been that race prejudice was primarily a matter of ignorance on the part of the mass of men, that when the truth was properly presented, the monstrous wrong of race hate must melt, and melt quickly before it," end quote. On this reasoning, it's because white Americans are ignorant, right? They suffer from a contingent absence of knowledge, that they believe myths of racial inferiority, and as a result, sustain racial dominance. Racial prejudice, then, is an epistemic problem in need of an epistemic solution. And as a result, early in his career, Du Bois seeks to supply the relevant knowledge to fill in these contingent gaps. And this is very much, the way he's thinking up until about World War I, when he begins to discover how deep racial prejudice runs within the American military, such that Black soldiers are having to fight Jim Crow within the US military, even as they're fighting the Nazis, right? And so you get all of these accounts and essays like The Black Man in the Great War, where Du Bois is describing how all of these white officers produce the very effect that they presume, right? So they presume Black soldiers to be incompetent, refuse to train them, and then when they're unable to do the work that's being asked of them, they then blame Black soldiers for being incompetent, right? So in other words, even though treating Black soldiers as equals and training them as such would be instrumentally useful to the US military's ability to fight the Nazis, they refuse to do it. So World War I, along with the rise in lynchings and increased segregation, is this turning point for Du Bois, right? Because while he used to think that racial prejudice was solely an epistemic problem, right? People just don't know the facts. He begins to think of it largely as a problem of the subconscious. As he writes, and I quote, "I saw defending this color bar, not simply ignorance and ill will, these to be sure, but also certain more powerful motives, less open to reason or appeal," end quote. These non-rational considerations include the desire for profit and what he calls the subconscious urges. Specifically, Du Bois begins to account for white supremacy in terms of habit or convention, or what he calls the conditioned reflexes of long-followed habits, customs, and folkways, of subconscious trains of reasoning and unconscious nervous reflexes, end quote. As Du Bois came to see, white Americans are racially prejudiced not because they lack information or facts or knowledge, but rather due to considerations that he calls unpierced by reason. In other words, Du Bois does not actually give up on his belief that white Americans can be brought around to support racial equality, but he does shift his views on how they're going to be brought around and how long it's going to take. To the extent that reason motivates action, as he formerly thought, the central task essentially consists in using facts and arguments to change the minds of white Americans and to persuade them to abandon racial dominance. This should be a relatively quick and straightforward task. But if ignorance is one factor that motivates white Americans to uphold racial dominance, and not the only or even the most important one, then supplying knowledge is radically insufficient for addressing the problem at hand. The problem is not merely in what white Americans know or don't know, but rather in what they subconsciously want. That is, for Du Bois, the problem consists in their desire for profit and also their subconscious impulses. And because these subconscious impulses are the result of generations of institutional conditioning into whiteness, they are significantly more robust than reason and will require significantly more time and effort to overturn. Of course, whiteness as a subconscious desire must come from somewhere because it's in no way intrinsic to people with light skin. According to Du Bois, these subconscious desires are produced and reproduced by social institutions, such as schools, newspapers, and art, which developed and perpetuated myths of racial inferiority to justify chattel slavery and the slave trade. Because the sum of scientific, historical, and sociological knowledge is clear that there is nothing rational about the belief that black people are subhuman, Du Bois concludes that such a belief, and I quote, is simply passionate, deep-seated heritage, and as such can be moved by neither argument nor fact. It is a vicious habit of mind, end quote. And while Du Bois is clear that the desire for profit through chattel slavery explains why social institutions invented racial myths and not the other way around, the persistence of these myths do not depend on the continued existence of chattel slavery. Social institutions persist after the abolition of chattel slavery and therefore persist in inculcating whiteness as a subconscious impulse. And so in this way, white Americans, according to Du Bois, are socialized into devaluing black life. And moreover, this socialization occurs so thoroughly that it is experienced as natural. That Du Bois describes whiteness as akin to a religious belief, that all through the world this gospel is preaching, suggests that it is akin to a metaphysical postulate, and therefore not subject to refutation by reasoned argument. Racialized moral and artistic values are, and I quote, continually wrong in picture and story, in newspaper heading and moving picture, in sermon and school book, resulting in the conviction that the king can do no wrong, a white man is always right, and a black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect, end quote. Du Bois's point goes beyond the notion here that values, whether moral or artistic, are racialized, but also that they have political effects. The socialization into whiteness, according to Du Bois, is what results in anti-black actions such as lynching and institutional practices such as segregation. And as Du Bois argues, this socialization into whiteness occurs in schools, the news, and art on an everyday basis. So if institutions inculcate these subconscious desires that shape human action, then to the extent that American institutions inculcate whiteness as a subconscious desire, anti-black violence and discrimination come as no surprise. For this reason, Du Bois characterizes white racial prejudice as, and I quote, the result of inherited customs and of those irrational and partly subconscious actions of men which control so large a proportion of their deeds, end quote. These inherited customs are attitudes and habits thus built up, and as a result, they cannot be changed by sudden assault, end quote. To put it differently, given the legacy of chattel slavery and the generations of socialization into whiteness, Du Bois would say that it would be bizarre if white Americans actually wanted equality. And it would be bizarre because this would require them to act in ways that are at odds with how they have been socialized to act. More broadly, Du Bois observes, the problem is not that white Americans do not know the facts that would motivate them to support racial equality, but that despite what they know or do not know, they do not want it. As Du Bois writes, and I quote, there is no way in which the American Negro can force this nation to treat him as an equal until the unconscious cerebration and folkways of the nation, as well as its rational, deliberate thought among the majority of whites, are willing to grant equality, end quote. Du Bois's point here is obvious, but it's worth stating clearly. A racially egalitarian and racially just society depends on the willingness of white Americans to relate to black Americans as equals. That is, it depends on a desire for sharing power with black Americans over the terms of collective existence. And until this occurs, a multiracial democracy is unrealizable, according to Du Bois. And crucially, according to Du Bois, this desire for equality is qualitatively distinct from what white Americans know to be true. For Du Bois, reason may be necessary, but it's radically insufficient for motivating white people to support a racially egalitarian society because it depends significantly more on a desire for equality than it does on knowing the truth of it. And because individuals cannot change what they want merely by changing what they know, facts and arguments are either inadequate or inappropriate methods for the task at hand. And this is one way that we can understand Du Bois's stark and bold claim, right, where he says, and I quote, "Negro prejudice is something that is beyond question and will. It is a stark, true fact, and little or nothing can be done about it at present," end quote. On first glance, the idea that racial prejudice is a stark, true fact might seem puzzling because it suggests that it's unchangeable, right, akin to a natural law, say like gravity. However, that phrase, "at present," modifies this fact, which suggests that the fact is temporally conditional, right? So this, I think, is what Du Bois is saying. Given our present conditions, right, namely how effectively our present social institutions inculcate whiteness as a subconscious impulse, racial prejudice is a stark, true fact in the present. And as we will see later, Du Bois does think that this present fact is changeable over the long future. And it's for this reason that he maintains hope that a racially just society is eventually realizable. However, that racial prejudice is a fact in the present means that, and I quote, "things are not going to change in the lifetime of those now living," end quote. And this is how we can understand Du Bois's deep pessimism about the prospects for a racially egalitarian society now. As he declares, and I quote, "there seems no hope that America in our day will yield in its color or race hatred in any substantial ground, and we will have no physical or economic power nor any alliance with other social or economic classes that will force compliance with decent civilized ideals in church, state, industry, or art," end quote. So part two here, on voluntary self-segregation. So because this white subconscious desire for racial dominance is presently unchangeable, Du Bois argues that Black Americans must act accordingly. That is, they ought to organize their own institutions to ensure their survival and well-being under conditions of racial dominance. While Du Bois saw these conditions, and specifically the subconscious desires of white people, as changeable over the long term through something like propaganda, such change would require many years and what he calls many generations. In fact, at some points he says, this is going to be the work of 10 centuries. However, he insisted that Black Americans should not sacrifice their own well-being while waiting for white desire to change. And as a result, Du Bois writes that there are certain things Black Americans must do for their own survival and self-preservation. Specifically here, he advocates for what he himself calls voluntary self-segregation, namely the creation of all Black hospitals, schools, and businesses to ensure access to quality healthcare, education, and financial stability. Separate institutions are necessary, according to Du Bois, because the robust nature of racial dominance is such that even desegregated institutions are discriminatory, denying Black Americans access to things like quality education and healthcare. And for this reason, Du Bois writes, and I quote, "the only thing that we can do and must do is to voluntarily and insistently to organize our economic and social power, no matter how much segregation it involves," end quote. So so education is actually one really concrete lens through which to understand Du Bois's thinking here, right? He insists that the ultimate ideal, right, the long-term goal, is a society where, and I quote, "racial animosities and class lines are so obliterated that separate schools will be anachronisms," end quote. However, the current fact of white race prejudice prevents Black children from being properly educated. And as a result, this requires that Black children should be educated in separate schools. Education, as Du Bois argues, requires what he calls a sympathetic touch between teacher and pupil, and such contact between pupils on the basis of perfect social equality, end quote. In other words, what Du Bois is saying here, right, is that you need certain kinds of ethical dispositions, right? Certain kinds of commitments, like to things like fairness, equal respect between teachers and between students with one another. And you need this in order for any sort of real education to be possible. However, the present fact of white race prejudice means that such ethical dispositions, such as a commitment to fairness and equality, don't exist. And as a result, this undercuts the conditions under which Black students can be properly educated, even in desegregated schools, right? So Du Bois keeps pointing out, right, that Black students are admitted but not welcomed at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia because they cannot get fair recognition, either in classroom or on campus, in dining halls or student activities, or basic human common courtesy, end quote. Simply integrating Black students into predominantly white, well-resourced schools does not, in other words, mean that they will be well-educated. And furthermore, Du Bois argues, placing Black children in predominantly white schools where they are not wanted is deeply harmful. He writes, and I quote, "I've repeatedly seen wise and loving colored parents take infinite pains to force their little children into schools where the white children, white teachers, and white parents despised and resented the dark child, made a mockery of it, neglected or bullied it, and literally rendered its life a living hell," end quote. Because of the brutal but real fact of white race prejudice, the Black child then becomes, quote unquote, a battering ram, navigating a hell where they're ridiculed and hated, end quote. Du Bois's point here is that integration is neither good nor bad, right? Rather, what he's doing is that he's challenging the kind of easy assumptions that integration solves the problem of discrimination. Because what he's seeing is that even in these desegregated spaces, a person can be integrated, right? They can be included into those desegregated spaces on fundamentally unequal terms. So by revealing what occurs when the white desire for racial dominance remains untransformed despite desegregation, Black students are treated unequally and suffer from a substandard education. Du Bois makes clear the imperative of transforming white desire. Unless white desire is transformed from desiring racial dominance to desiring equality, Du Bois does not think that desegregation will foster equality. Rather, it will simply generate a new context for racial dominance. So one way to think about the shift in Du Bois's own thinking about segregation is his realization that segregation is one but not the only way for white Americans to subordinate Black Americans. Racial subordination can also take place in desegregated spaces. And so to the extent that the white impulse to subordinate Black life persists, desegregation is radically insufficient for fostering equality. The desires of white Americans themselves, Du Bois would say, must also be transformed so that these desegregated spaces are also racially egalitarian. Inclusion through desegregation is not enough. What is required is inclusion on equal terms. Moreover, because white racial prejudice is remarkably robust, such that Du Bois writes, the attitude on the part of white people is not going to materially change in our time, the expectation that white attitudes can be immediately transformed is nonsensical. In fact, Du Bois views these efforts to immediately transform the attitudes of white teachers and students as a silly waste of time, money, and temper. Because the refusal of white teachers and students that he's observing, right, to treat Black children as equals is so robust, it is a futile attempt, he writes, to compel even by law a group to do what it is determined not to do, end quote. And as a result, Du Bois is oftentimes, he expresses his horror, right, at Black parents who, as what he calls an academic pronouncement, denounce the evils of segregation and then send their own helpless, immature child into the schools where white children kick, cuff, or abuse him, where teachers openly and persistently neglect or hurt or dwarf its soul. In other words, Du Bois realizes that the question of separate versus mixed spaces is actually a red herring. What is significant is whether or not a group is using its power to subordinate another group and to thereby dictate the terms of its existence. So in this way, Du Bois is identifying, right, and challenging the conflation of a physical space with a power dynamic, right? Namely, he's challenging the conflation of segregation with discrimination and desegregation with non-discrimination. To be clear, Du Bois's emphasis on the imperative to transform white desire doesn't mean that desegregation is unimportant. However, his point is that unless such transformation occurs, such that white Americans actually want equality with black Americans, desegregated schools will be characterized by racial dominance, and tragically, black children will bear the cost. For Du Bois, this is unacceptable. Accepting racial dominance in a desegregated school is, as he writes, is to accept a proffered equality, which is not equality, for it is to submit to discrimination simply because it does not involve actual and open segregation, end quote. As Du Bois sees it, until we address the core problem, namely the white impulse to subordinate black life, desegregated schools will not really be qualitatively distinct from segregated ones with respect to treating black students as equals worthy of an education. Finally, Du Bois's commitment to separate black schools is not an absolute principle, right? He declares, you can't really lay down an unconditional law or an inflexible principle. If, as he says, basically, if you look around, if black parents look around in their own neighborhoods and they see that actually, you don't have a lot of racial prejudice and black children can get a decent education in mixed schools, he says, fine, send your child to a mixed school, right? There's no reason to move your child into an all-black school then. However, he writes, if Negro children cannot receive a decent and sympathetic education in all-white schools and no Negro teachers can be employed, then for us there is no choice. And black children ought to attend separate schools. In other words, for Du Bois, a black parent's decision to put their child in either a segregated or a mixed school is a response to present facts. Specifically, it's a response to the willingness or unwillingness of whites to treat black students as equals, worthy of education. So the question is not, should we prefer mixed or segregated schools, but rather, given present facts, what are the best prospects for educating black children? That voluntary self-segregation is a conditional response to the white refusal to live in relations of equality with black Americans implies then that if white attitudes change, then the conditions for black voluntary self-segregation are no longer salient. In other words, it's conditional, right? He writes, and I quote, when my roommate gets too noisy and dirty, I leave him. When my neighbors get too annoying and insulting, I seek another home. When white Americans refuse to treat me as a man, I will cut my intercourse with them to the minimum demanded me by decent living, end quote. As the analogy makes clear, voluntary self-segregation is not an unconditional principle. If one's neighbors are not noisy, dirty, annoying, insulting, then there's no reason to voluntarily self-segregate. Rather, it is a response to the white refusal to treat black Americans with dignity and respect. And specifically, it's a way for black Americans to ensure their own well-being in a society where white Americans do not yet want equality. But if the white desire for racial dominance is robust, it's still changeable, according to Du Bois, albeit changeable very, very slowly. The present fact of white supremacy dooms the prospects of a racially egalitarian society for now, but this fact is changeable over the long term. And a racially egalitarian society is possible eventually, one day, in the long distant future. If realizing a racially egalitarian society depends on the subconscious desires of white Americans for equality, then the key then consists in transforming their present subconscious desires. And while Du Bois estimates that this transformation is going to be the work of 10 centuries, he holds out hope that such a society is one day possible. Key to the transformation of the white subconscious, as Du Bois sees it, is propaganda through art. Because non-rational factors, right, that is the irrational and unconscious habits, the folkways and customs, sustain the desires for racial dominance, Du Bois declares, to attack and better all this calls for more than appeal and argument. We must apply other remedies and judgments if we would get justice and right to prevail in the world. It calls for a long, patient, well-planned, and persistent campaign of propaganda, end quote. According to Du Bois, it's not nearly enough to change minds. You also have to target the vast area of the subconscious and the irrational, of habit and convention. So while facts and arguments supply the relevant knowledge that white Americans contingently lack, propaganda exists to transform these subconscious impulses, such that eventually white Americans will be willing to grant equality. Just so we're clear here, Du Bois actually uses propaganda in about two different ways, right? One is the more sort of conventional pejorative way that most of us understand propaganda to be, right? Namely, the kind of distortion of historical or factual truth. And this is one way that Du Bois certainly uses it, right? If you look at his essay, The Propaganda of History, he uses the term propaganda to describe how dominant narratives of Reconstruction distort historical evidence that Black Americans were agents of their own freedom. So propaganda in that particular instance, right, and as we typically understand it, is typically understood as a falsehood, right, for maintaining or sustaining racial dominance in that particular case. But it's a falsehood where the remedy is truth or facts. But this isn't the only way that Du Bois employs the term propaganda. The other way, and the other way that I'm going to talk about today, is when he's using the term to refer to a mode of inculcating ideals or values. So this kind of propaganda is the subject of Du Bois's essay, Criteria of Negro Art. And as I've mentioned already, right, the problem of white supremacy is not that white Americans lack facts, such that if they just had the right facts, they would be motivated to act differently. Rather, the problem of white supremacy for Du Bois is that white Americans do not value Black life as they do their own. Propaganda, then, is a method through which Du Bois addresses, then, the problem of value. Specifically, artist propaganda aims to transform the values of white Americans from racial dominance to equality. As he famously declares, all art is propaganda and ever must be. More specifically, according to Du Bois, art that conveys Black humanity has the power to challenge and transform existing values. Independent Black art, that is, art that is free of the constraints placed upon it by anti-Black appetites of white audiences, has the potential to be politically transformative. And in this way, Du Bois thinks that white Americans will eventually value what they do not currently value. They will come to value Black life as they do their own. In fact, to the extent that all art is propaganda, Du Bois does not centrally object to art that presumes white blood divine, infallible, and holy, as he would write about Birth of a Nation. Rather, what he objects to is the denial of a similar right to propaganda to those who believe Black blood human, lovable, and inspired with new ideals for the world, end quote. In other words, for Du Bois, art that conveys Black humanity is a form of propaganda that can and should transform the desires of white Americans. So Black Americans, according to Du Bois, ought to engage in this long-term project of propaganda to transform American public culture so that eventually white Americans might come to want what they don't yet want. However, as Du Bois argues, the current aesthetic economy driven by the appetite for anti-Blackness in white audiences renders it difficult for artists to create work that actually expresses Black humanity. As noted earlier, Du Bois views Birth of a Nation, right, as a film that inculcates these anti-Black desires in a predominantly white audience, but he also thinks that art and desires are mutually reinforcing. Right? It's not simply that a racist film like Birth of a Nation inculcates anti-Black desires in a white audience, but it's also the fact that he thinks that this has the effect of white audiences then developing an appetite for anti-Blackness. And as a result, they are not inclined to consume art that challenges it. They will not pay for art that portrays themselves as fallible and Blackness as human. And this then reinforces an aesthetic economy that caters to the anti-Black desires of white audiences. Right? According to Du Bois, white Americans, and I quote, want Uncle Tom, Topsies, good darkies, and clowns, end quote. They want images of Black Americans as grateful subordinates or as sources of entertainment, but not as complex human beings like themselves. And as a result, This is why they want to consume only degraded forms of blackness, such as the Black Charleston underworld. And as a result, white gatekeepers, right, such as editors and film producers, continue to promote these degraded images of blackness. And in fact, Du Bois thinks that this aesthetic economy, right, which is constituted by these white gatekeepers who cater to and reinforce white appetites for anti-blackness, is pretty robust, right? And as a result, it's so robust that it tends to operate independently of what artists themselves want to create, right? So as he writes, and I quote, "I should not be surprised if Octavius Roy Cohen, who's a white artist, had approached the Saturday Evening Post and asked permission to write about a different kind of colored folk than the monsters he had created. But if he had, the Post had replied, 'No, you're getting paid to write about the kind of colored people you are writing about,' end quote. Because the white artist is beholden to white gatekeepers, who in turn are beholden to the white public, the desires of the white public dictate the kind of art that artists end up producing, right? Specifically, the white appetite for degraded images of blackness limit the kind of art that is encouraged and publicized. Artists who want to depict human complexity cannot do so because their work will not see the light of day. And as a result, the only way for artists, and in this case specifically he's thinking about white artists, to convey the truth of human complexity is to racialize vices and virtues, right? As Du Bois puts it, and I quote, "The only chance Cohen had to tell the truth of pitiful human degradation was to tell it of colored people," end quote. So specifically, the white artist can only tell stories of the Black Charleston underworld because they cannot do a similar thing for the white people of Charleston, or they would drive him out of town, end quote. As a result, Du Bois sees no way for artists, even white ones, to create work that articulates the complex humanity of Black Americans for mainstream venues. Describing the plight of Black artists, Du Bois writes, "In all sorts of ways we are hemmed in, and our new young artists have got to fight their way to freedom." Because the white public has little interest in art that portrays blackness in non-monstrous ways, the only way for such art to exist is to create venues in which artists do not have to conform to the expectations of these gatekeepers and of white audiences. And it's for this reason that Du Bois argues that Black artists need their own cultural infrastructure to tell the truth of Black humanity in their art. Such art would not be bound to express the moral righteousness of white people and the degradation of Black people. It could tell the truth about white degradation and of Black creativity and beauty. In destigmatizing Blackness, then, such art would disentangle Blackness from degradation, while also showing that degradation is human and therefore is not actually racialized. Likewise, art that is truthful and free would depict white people as human and therefore without idealizing them, and hence whiteness as morally righteous. In short, such art would express the truth of human complexity, grasping how beauty and degradation are features of humanity, and therefore do not define any particular group. A truthful art, in other words, would de-racialize these vices and virtues so that we would eventually see them as human vices and virtues. And so one way then to understand Du Bois's work, right, as the editor of The Crisis, which is the sort of the magazine of the NAACP, was really as a builder of cultural infrastructure, right? He writes, "We must come to the place where the work of art as it appears is reviewed and acclaimed by our own free and unfettered judgment." According to Du Bois, only when the work of Black artists is evaluated by Black cultural institutions and peers will it be free of the need to cater to the anti-Black appetite in white audiences. This is then the meaning of freedom in Black art, the ability to create art that does not conform to white expectations of Blackness. Furthermore, if all art is propaganda, because all art inculcates ideals, the relevant question then is what ideals it inculcates. And to the extent that Du Bois observes that anti-Black art is a type of propaganda that leads to anti-Black violence, he implies that art that is truthful about humanity has the potential to reshape the desires of white Americans. And this eventually creates the conditions for a racially just society. More broadly then for Du Bois, Black action operates on this dual temporal horizon. And for him, that means that exclusively focusing on one at the expense of the other is a mistake. It's a mistake for Black Americans to exclusively engage in what he calls the long siege, without also voluntarily self-segregating, because to do so would undercut their present survival and well-being. But for Du Bois, it's also a mistake for Black Americans to exclusively focus their energies on voluntary self-segregation and neglect the long-term work of propaganda, because this forecloses the possibilities of a racially just society, far away though it may be. As he argues, it would not do to concenter all effort on economic well-being and forget freedom and manhood and equality, end quote. Emphasizing the dual need for Black Americans to ensure their present well-being and act to create the conditions for a racially egalitarian future, he argues, Negroes must live and eat and strive and still hold unfaltering commerce with the stars, end quote. In short, for Du Bois, Black Americans must act for their present day survival, even as they also act for the long-term goal of a racially just society, a society that they themselves will not experience. Action then takes place on these two timelines, right? Voluntary self-segregation in the present and propaganda for the sake of a racially just future. So to conclude really briefly, right? Between 1920 and 1940, Du Bois is really thinking very seriously about how Black Americans can both survive white supremacy and eventually abolish it. It's precisely because the desire for racial dominance is so powerful amongst white Americans that it cannot be changed immediately. And this is why Du Bois is pessimistic about the prospects of a just society right now, and why he thinks that the only thing Black Americans can do for now is to survive it through voluntary self-segregation. At the same time, he also thinks that this subconscious desire, while highly robust and unchangeable for now, is changeable over the long term through propaganda. He argues they need to engage in propaganda, and specifically art, to transform the desires of white people so that white people will eventually, in the future, want equality with Black Americans. They will then eventually want what they do not yet want. And in this way, Du Bois sought to save the minds and the bodies of Black folk now, even as he sought to save the souls of white folk in the future. Returning to the introduction, I think a Du Boisian approach to the hope and pessimism in the aftermath of the summer 2020 protests would be to affirm that both are true, although not simultaneously, right? Du Bois, I think, would affirm the pessimism of those who argue that very little or nothing has changed. In fact, he would say the white-Black backlash to racial equity efforts is real. And this is because white supremacy is robust in ways that cannot be quickly dismantled. More specifically, he would argue that the persistence of white supremacy is rooted in the white subconscious. That is, the desire for racial dominance that is the result of institutional conditioning over generations. However, he would dispute how pessimists presume that white supremacy is unchangeable forever. If the white subconscious has been shaped in one way, he would say it can be reshaped in other ways. And for this reason, Du Bois would affirm the hope of those who, during the protests, imagined a more racially just future as a real possibility. Through art as propaganda, Du Bois would argue that the white subconscious can be transformed in ways that make justice possible. However, he would challenge those who imagine that such a society is just around the corner or can be achieved perhaps in our lifetimes. And in this way, he reframes our temporal horizon for understanding how long it will take to achieve a society that is truly just. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So that was wonderful. Thank you.
So I was wondering, I know Du Bois talked a lot about like education or segregating education-wise. Wouldn't the same logic work with pretty much any, or would the same logic work with pretty much any like social institution, and therefore mean that you kind of have to segregate kind of everything socially?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so education was just the one that I focused on for this talk, but yeah, one other really obvious example that he points out has to do with hospitals, essentially, and in like the 30s, and this is like a big source of controversy, right, within amongst Du Bois and other writers and other black writers and black doctors at the time, right? In 1934, there's this thing called the Rosenwald Fund, right, which is a government fund that is created to help support the training of black doctors in these sort of separate black hospitals, right? And the main pushback, right, he gets is from like other black doctors, right, who say, you are just reinforcing white supremacy this way, you are reinforcing segregation. What you should really be doing, Du Bois, is you should be fighting for meritocratic admissions standards for medical schools. What you should really be fighting for is a desegregated hospital. And Du Bois says, look, he's like, that's my ideal too, right? My ideal is a desegregated hospital where everyone gets treated, right, with care and concern and equality and respect. But he's like, the reality is like, we can desegregate, a hospital, and what's going to happen is that, you're going to bring the black patients into these predominantly white hospitals with white doctors and nurses, and the black patients are just not going to be cared for, right? They will be in the same space, but they're going to be neglected. And he's like, well, what kind of, what good is that, right? And so, so he has kind of a similar kind of back and forth about, the question of, the same sort of, and the same issues are at play, right? When he's thinking about hospitals, he's also thinking about education. And so, yeah, I mean, the sort of short answer, I think, is that he would say, yeah, like if, the question becomes, what is the good that black Americans need access to, right? And if it's, whether it's healthcare, education, whatever else it might be, he would say, look, is it the case that, he would say, well, look at your society, right? If it's the case that your society is structured in such a way that, the ability of black Americans to access these goods, these necessary goods for survival and well-being is obstructed, then yeah, you gotta go create your own institutions, essentially, and your own sort of separate institutions, just to make sure that like black people are gonna survive this thing, right? He really is uninterested in a kind of symbolism. There kind of comes a point where he's like, this desegregation, unless it's substantive, unless it also means equality, it's symbolic. And now you're going to sacrifice black people to symbolism? And he's like, no, we're not having that anymore. So there is really a shift that happens, I want to say, pre and post World War I, and it would apply beyond education, for sure.
Thank you for your talk. My color and design class is here because we've been looking at Du Bois's data visualizations. Have you ever seen these before?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought that whether or not those operated on the level of propaganda that you were talking about in terms of ways to transform, consciousness, these kinds of things, or whether they fell more into the earlier category of because they're really amazing images, and they're kind of peculiar in a way, and artful and unfolding, in a way that I usually don't see graphs and stuff. So I was wondering if you thought they would be an example of that.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really great question. I don't have a firm view on whether it's more knowledge versus propaganda. I mean, I feel like the cop-out answer is to say they're probably both, right? But at the same, I guess, so here are the relevant questions, right? It seems to me like it's pretty obvious that is one form of knowledge, right? It's a way of conveying information, right? So I think it's definitely a form of giving more information and making it presentable, right? In ways that are easily accessible, easily digestible. So I think there's no doubt that it definitely is a form of information presenting, right? I guess the question is it also a mode of propaganda? And I guess the question I would want to think more about here would be, is there something about the way that the graphs or the images are presented? Is there something about the aesthetic quality of that presentation that has an effect that affects, white people's subconscious in a way that is not as effective as if he just presented it, in sort of black and white charts, right? And that would be sort of the question I would think about, right? Is like, is there something about the aesthetic presentation of the way that the data visualization is presented that goes beyond just like regurgitating statistics? And if it does, then I would say it probably has a kind of propagandistic dimension, even though, the things that, when he's writing Criteria of Negro Art, like he's thinking of like poetry and novels and like, the visual arts in a more conventional sense. But it's a good question, and I'd have to think more about that. I'm inclined to say like it probably has some propagandistic elements, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I got, in terms of Du Bois offering propaganda as kind of like the way forward to go here, I kind of got stuck in a cycle of trying to understand how he intends to, have this break through the, cognitive barrier that white people have when, the means of, distribution of this propaganda, right, the capital control that really, allows that kind of to diffuse through society, right, is, inherently out beyond their power potentially, right? Especially, right, when he's talking about this idea of, self-segregation, right, it also makes me wonder, like, how can this be successful, right, when, the reason why this inequality exists in the first place is because of an inequality distribution of capital power in society. So, how would that be successful? And then, how does the propaganda, successfully break that kind of hold in a way?
So if I understand your question, it sounds like you have sort of two.
It really all just relates around the idea that I was kind of stuck on, where, I mean, Du Bois talks in Black Reconstruction in America, right? The idea that, post-Revolutionary War, right, slaves are set free, but, they're left with just about nothing, right? And there was plenty of attempts to step forward, right, make some changes, but eventually, right, they're left again on their own, and, the reactionary, Klan attacks and all the kind of, hate crimes occur, and they're back to square one again.
Right.
And I just wonder, how successful can we hope propaganda to be when, there is this disparity of power in terms of... Right.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think so, for Du Bois, it's that, so just to take the sort of, we'll take the voluntary self-segregation piece first. How can that be successful? I think for Du Bois, he would say, I mean, the problem, I mean, so going back to sort of the Rosenwald Fund, for instance, right? Like, that's, and he also discusses when he's the editor of The Crisis, various federal government plans to say, like, to devote money to public housing in, like, predominantly black neighborhoods, right? And Du Bois in each of those instances says, absolutely, we have to take the money, even though it's going to be for segregated spaces, right? And every single time he's fighting, right, with other people within the black community who are saying, no, we can't take this federal money because now we're just reinforcing segregation, right? And Du Bois's response every single time is like, look, the segregation is gonna be here no matter what, right? Like, this is a fact. So the question is, how do you best organize your energies and your resources, and how do you make decisions in light of this fact, right? And so, like, that's one way in which when we think about, when you think about sort of Du Bois's views on voluntary self-segregation, he would say, look, you don't try to fight it. And when the opportunities exist, like the federal government is like, here's a bunch of money to create some all-black hospitals and to train black doctors, you don't say no to that. And when they're like, here's some money for public housing for these like black neighborhoods, he would say, you don't say no to that, right? So that's like one sort of, it doesn't fully, he also has more ambitious plans, to be sure. He's like, for a while, he's like, we should have this sort of totally self-segregated economy as well, right? And like that is really, he also thinks like capitalism is about to end, right? Which turns out that hasn't really worked out. But but so, so there's certainly, there's some ways in which, you can see sort of his thinking in terms of, how are we going to make it work? Well, certainly don't decline opportunities and funds and resources when the money is offered to you to make some version of it work, right? But beyond that, I take your point. It's not, the question is like how, aside from, federal funding that's just kind of offered here and there, how else, are you going to build up these separate institutions so that they are very well funded and well resourced so that they can actually, right, provide good access to quality goods, right, for Black Americans. And that is kind of a bigger sort of question mark, I think, for Du Bois that, or at least one that I haven't fully worked out.
I thought that idea of the voluntary self-segregation was really interesting. I'd never heard of anything like that. But it reminds me of just a few days ago when I was in Chinatown, and I never noticed, but there are like there's like Chinese banks, Chinese schools. So I guess my question is, did Du Bois, or might Du Bois, like prescribe the same solution for other non-white, non-Black races in America, or is it?
Oh, yeah. Would he prescribe that? I don't know. I mean, as far as I know, I don't know if he ever actually did in his own writings. I haven't come across it yet. That doesn't mean he never did or never thought about it. But yeah, I think your reflection on this is really, I think there's something telling about this, right? That when we read about voluntary self-segregation in Du Bois' thought, and he's certainly not the first person to have come up with this or to advocate for it, we imagine it as being this like very like bizarre radical idea. But actually, no, like Chinatown is a version of this, Japantown, like the various ethnic minority communities, right, that have established like their own communities, right, essentially with goods and services such that, the dollar really kind of stays within the community for a very long time before it ever leaves that community. And so, I think the more sort of ordinary example is the one that actually most people are actually pretty familiar with, like you've just mentioned. I think Du Bois would say, look, other minorities are already doing this. Might be something that he would say, but I don't have like a good beyond that. I'm not sure. I'd have to think more about it.
Thank you so much for your talk. Hi.
Hi. I wasn't sure where the voice was coming
I'm
from.
fighting.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's always really exciting to talk about Du Bois because his work just offers so much for thinking about our moment. Mm-hmm. And I have a question that's, I don't know, something I'm very interested in. I'm going to pick up on the Black Reconstruction thread. Sure. And what you talked about at the beginning and end of your talk. Yeah. So this idea that we have to like shift, white desires have to be shifted. So in Black Reconstruction, that happens because the black workers go on a general strike, yeah, and do not work. They interrupt production. Mm-hmm. And then it's too much to say, but there's this glimmer of abolition democracy, yep, that happens as a result of a general strike, mm-hmm, of the non-white yeah, producing class. Right. So I'm just curious, I would love to, I know this is like different, maybe later Du Bois, but because you were talking about, the uprisings that just happened, yeah, and this sort of complicated moment that we're in, mm-hmm, like, what do you, have you been thinking about this idea of abolition democracy and pessimism and stuff for our moment and the relevance of that idea for our moment? Because I would love to know.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that last question? Yeah.
So during these uprisings, there were all these like reading lists that were going, yes, around that were like, yes, abolition now, abolition democracy, with this very radical interpretation of what that meant. In fact, it was like workers went on strike. Right. And social institutions had to change to support their basic needs. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I'm like, what does that mean for us today? Okay. And because you're talking about the uprisings and these like demands, yeah, yeah, like I'm just so curious to know if you have any thoughts about like, I know this is not about propaganda,
Right.
But
Right.
like it's more about uprisings and like self-segregated spaces could maybe be a part of it, but like I don't know. This idea of, I know you were talking about pessimism in the present and like
Yeah.
long-term,
Yeah.
more long-term visions.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious to know, like, if you're thinking about abolition democracy and what you're thinking about.
Yeah, in terms of, yeah, that's a great question. It's not something, I'd have to think more about those specific questions that you're thinking about there, that you're raising. I mean, one thing I will say, it's not in this talk, but something that I agree with you in the sense that Du Bois always seems relevant, right? Like he's never not relevant for whatever moment we're in. I think that it's not super surprising to me that, you know, we can still, so I don't have anything specific to say about the abolition democracy in the sort of Du Boisian sense right now. But I will say, like, you know, we're still in a pandemic, right? And one of the things that I came across recently is that, you know, the percentage of Black families that have chosen to homeschool their children, right, has really shot up, right? And it's not just because, like, the pandemic. It's like they have really just, they're like, nope, we're done, right? We're done with, like, the racism in, like, predominantly white spaces. And, you know, Du Bois isn't thinking about homeschooling, but the idea of, like, withdrawing from a space that's hostile because it actually undercuts your ability to learn how to do math, right? I think like that's kind of something that, you know, when I came across that news, I was like, oh, that's Du Boisian, right? When a couple of other examples I'll just sort of throw out that always make me think about Du Bois, right? I think also, right, when there was a big scandal at UNC Chapel Hill over the summer about the hiring of Nicole Hannah-Jones, and when she finally put out a press release that said, I'm not going where I'm not wanted anymore. And she takes her talents to Howard University, right? That logic is Du Boisian, right? That you do not keep pushing for acceptance into a space where you're not wanted, right? And for her, right, it's a kind of, yeah, like we could keep trying to push to like desegregate, right, and integrate more fully, but the question is like at what cost, right? And I think like those are the kinds of Du Boisian things that I think about. And yeah, I mean, I think there are more, but yeah, I've totally evaded your question by giving you some other examples of things, but
That was I love that answer. Thank you so much.
So I hate to do this, but we are out of time, and you know we have to give up the room to the next class. So I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Professor Ikuta for a wonderful talk.